Nick.
Hi everyone, I'm Nick Pollock. I'm the CEO of K2 Fly. We are an enterprise, an ASX listed enterprise software business, business to business software business with a focus on resource governance. So this conversation couldn't be more important, we believe, and very central to our beliefs that all resources are precious and that those that have been given the privilege to manage those resources are obliged to put in good resource governance practices for all the stakeholders' concerns, as well as the regulators and investors. So this is central to us. Just to give you some examples of where we play. So we are a software provider. We now work with Rio Tinto across a number of areas, including heritage, post-Jukin, ground disturbance in the Pilbara, which is really important, and BHP as well in that area as well. We work with some of the world's biggest companies in tailings disclosure. So we're building software that supports the new tailings management, GISTM globally. And we work extensively across the top 50 mining companies in terms of their resource disclosures, in terms of their inventory disclosures that go in their annual report and to the stock market. So we are the big G in ESG, but as you can see from some of the things we do, we work across the spectrum.
Great, thanks, Nick. And what about you, Hakan?
Thank you, Marianne. So my name is Hakan Ostjelik. I'm the Enterprise Solutions Manager for ESG, our ESG and Sustainability Solutions at Austmine. It's fundamentally a business development role across the portfolio of our organisation. Austmine itself has close to well over about 250 Australian miners as clients within Australia, as well as over 1,000 overseas. We've been around for about 40 years, providing solutions to technical challenges within the mining sector and the resources sector in general through a combination of advisory. For example, we have Snowden Montero as our advisory division, through consulting, through services, and also quite a broad range of software platforms. We have about 30 solutions now encompassing all of those things across exploration, geology, planning, operations, trading. And in recent years, there's through both organic development as well as acquisition in ESG and sustainability management across all of these business processes. Why this conversation is important to me? Well, as every stakeholder knows, from top to bottom in any organisation, governance can't really be separated from many aspects in running the business, particularly those related to environmental and social criteria. However, what we're seeing is that many stakeholders aren't quite exercising governance over these criteria, and even though they know that they need to. And in saying that, it's something that we all have a desire and a drive to change, and that's why this topic of governance is important to me, to bring governance over those environmental and social criteria under the ESG banner. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, Hakan. That leads me, if you can stay on, that leads me into the next question. You know that the focus is often on the E and the S, environmental and social, with less focus on the G. So it's why is it important that we have this discussion?
Yeah, look, it's important for mining because in practicality, governance can never really be separated from any of the commitments and actions during a mine's life cycle. It's because a key outcome of a lack of governance is that it introduces risk, or worse, significant risk into an organisation. There's a whole group of technologies that you can use or processes that you can use, but without the oversight of governance over that information, data, process, etc., there is risk introduced into the business. In fact, the best practice of and excelling in governance calls for not only, I guess, mastering and being compliant with, the letter of the law, policy, standards, and so forth, but also the essence of governance is also important as well within a business. For example, in the context of ESG, it might have something to do with, for example, getting ahead of violations before they occur, or ensuring transparency and dialogue with regulators, for example. That might be another example there, instead of just submitting a report and letting the result themselves. So in answer to the question, it's important to have this conversation because ultimately effective governance is about insight, foresight, management, and minimization of risk.
Great, thank you. Nick, have you got anything to add to that, the importance, why it's important that we're having this conversation?
Oh, absolutely. Look, Newmont is a very important client of ours, and Tom Palmer, the CEO of Newmont, puts it very succinctly, I think, when he says that, without the G, there is no E and S. So, think about that for a minute. It's an important statement. So what we see a lot of in companies striving to be the best they can in terms of implementing various systems on the ground to capture this data, whether that be from, dam stability or a community, stakeholders relations, et cetera, all that's fantastic, but none of it means very much unless there's ability to be able to see that from the executive and board level and be able to understand the implications of decisions made. And we've seen some really interesting examples of that in the last few years. So picking up from Hakan's point, I think he said that, you can put all the systems in place, but unless you've got that direct line of sight, sign off, and particularly in a world where increasingly we're seeing more and more legislation being passed around greenwashing, what is the provenance of that data that you're disclosing to the market? Where does it come from? Who signed it off? Were they competent? Et cetera, et cetera. So that's going to become, and that came out of IMARC as well, really, really important as we go forward.
Sorry, thanks, Nick. Justin, what do you think?
Fantastic points, Nick and Hakan, and I couldn't agree more. I think ESG is becoming more about transparency. Shareholders and stakeholders are demanding more in terms of transparency. It's no longer good enough to have a pretty boardroom strategy that sort of articulates what you're doing from an ESG perspective. The maturity around ESG has shifted in the market significantly, and it's now important that those control strategies that you describe in those strategies are permeating your business and actually delivering sustainable change at the working face. So governance plays a huge role in that, being able to clearly, not only from a framework development perspective and articulating what your KPIs are, but verifying the effective implementation of those KPIs and then having the opportunity to report on those to your shareholders and stakeholders is becoming extremely important. So I won't harp on again around some of the points that Hakan and Nick have already described, but governance is like Nick alluded to, without the G, there's no E and S.
It's a great line, isn't it? I'm written that down for future.
I want to point out that I heard that at Newmont quoting Tom Palmer. I've Googled it and I can't find him saying it anyway, but I'm going to give it to him anyway. But you can make it your own if you want it.
Okay, thank you. Great, thank you. That's a fantastic introduction to the topic. Justin, I might stick with you if that's okay. You mentioned that Talisman Technical has an ESG arm that supports miners in development and deployment of their ESG strategies and frameworks. Wondering what changes you're seeing in the governance space when you're working with those clients.
Yeah, thanks. It's a good lead on from the conversation we're just having. The governance piece is coming to bear. I think, we touched on the fact that environmental compliance and greenhouse gas emissions were the focus of sustainability for a very long period of time, with the S and the G often being the forgotten soldiers. So I think that's changing significantly. We've seen a rapid transition in the ESG landscape. In an international context, we had international ESG and sustainability standards to which the financial companies initially subscribed as part of sustainable lending practices. We've seen that shift into a local context where, groups like ICMM and OSIM are now requiring independent ESG auditing in order to gain certification and membership for those particular companies, for those particular brands. So the governance aspects are growing significantly, and proving your ESG credentials around governance are growing significantly. I think a lot of those sort of soft laws, if you want to call them that, from an international and national sustainability framework perspective, are now starting to transition into hard law and legislation. We've seen things like modern slavery come on board. It's not only about scope 1 and scope 2 emissions anymore, it's about scope 3 and how you're managing your supply chain. So from me, it's what we thought was going to be happening in a couple of years in relation to the ESG journey is happening within a couple of months. And the governance requirements around it are becoming stricter. The resource operators, a lot of them are in different journeys, and a lot of supply chains are in different aspects of the journey. Some are very mature and have been doing this for years. Some are still trying to understand what ESG means and how to operationalize it into their business. So I think as that general transition around governance continues to increase, we're going to see everyone is going to have to start to come on that journey very quickly around governance control.
Great, thank you. So are you seeing any emerging, we mentioned just then the particularly the E, what about workforce safety and staying ahead of compliance? What's happening in that space?
There's been a lot of focus on workforce safety. We do a lot of work in the coal sector in particular within Queensland and New South Wales. We would have, most people are aware of the significant regulatory changes that have occurred, particularly within the Coal Mining Safety and Health Act and regulation, the introduction of industrial manslaughter, to align with the Work Health and Safety Act. There's been significant changes in relation to punitive and prosecutorial measures. That's having a downstream impact actually on the technical resources that are available and people wanting to work in statutory positions because of those particular measures. Of course, all of those form part of ESG. Traditionally, people have thought that safety and compliance might sit as its own sort of banner, but certainly falls under the ESG banner. We're seeing a lot of work around automation and technology, particularly in critical control management, again, within coal. After recent significant events within the Queensland resources sector specifically, there are potentially some legislative changes coming around integrating critical control management into legislation, and a lot of automation and technology being introduced to support that. And that's really around reviewing the effective implementation of core critical controls to ensure that they are maintained effectively over time to prevent significant material events. From a workforce health and safety perspective, there are a lot of programs out there, but there's also been a big shift towards psychological safety and workforce psychology and psychologically safe workplaces. And that is certainly, I guess, at the front of conversation at the moment, as well as high reliability organizations, which came out of the Brady Review a couple of years ago now, but companies are now sort of wrap their heads around what that actually means, how to operationalize some of those findings and bring them not only into the operations, but also into regulation.
Yeah, there's a lot going on, isn't there? Thank you. Nick, I might turn to you. You mentioned all resources are precious, which I think we all would agree with. How does K2Fly approach the topic of resource governance, and what changes are you seeing in the space?
Yeah, it changes everything, right? So before I do that, I just want to talk about, pick up on Justin's point about the evolution of safety in the industry, right? So for those that have been in the industry for a while, I think that there's a lot of parallels in what we're seeing with the evolution of ESG to safety and the way that unfolded in the industry and how it became front of mind and ever present in everything that we do over a period of time through, very proactive initiatives. So I think we're going to see that more and more of ESG. In terms of our approach, we start at the root sort of, I guess, governance elements of many resource companies, which is their disclosure of their mineral resources and reserves. So effectively their inventory, which has been highly regulated since Bre-X in the 1980s in Canada. So there's obviously, because investors cannot see what's going on underground, there's very strict codes. And so for Australian audience, that's JORC. Coming for the ASX in South Africa, it's SAMREC, and in the US recently they've changed it SK 1300 requirements. So we build software that supports all of those standards. So if I was to use Rio as an example, they have the same inventory in the ground, but they report to the Australian Stock Exchange, the New York Stock Exchange, and the London Stock Exchange, each a little differently. So that sort of gives you the complexity of this. And of course, investors can't see what's happening with ESG at site, et cetera. So there's an increasing focus on disclosure. So, we come at it from that very, very well understood governance layer where you're rolling up data from site through the layers of the business till you get to the peak of the organisation in order to disclose information that goes to the annual report and in fact to your regulators and shareholders. So highly impactful on the value or the devalue of the company. And we're seeing, obviously, to Justin's point, the evolution of those what might have been called softer factors are becoming harder and harder. And so even to the point when you look at the new JORC code, you can't really value a mineral inventory without applying some ENS factors to that. So in today's world, arguably that's always been done, but it's coming front and center. So they're addressing those sorts of issues. So by providing that framework, so we implemented that structure in order that competent people sign off, there's accountability, and then obviously transparency, auditability, and then ultimately disclosure, and all of that is clear. So that we're working through. So we provide a platform. We think of it like almost like a spreadsheet with lots of tabs at the bottom. What do I want a governance framework on in terms of which area am I looking at? Is it resources? Is it tailings? And my disclosures there, is it heritage? Is it rehab, et cetera, et cetera. So we provide that platform and we build it in order to apply with the standards. We're not creating the standards. We work around the standards like the ICMM, like the regulators, like JORC, et cetera, et cetera. So that's our role in this.
Thanks, Nick. With that overall platform, I imagine there would often, or there could be conflicts between managing environmental priorities against social priorities. I'm just wondering how those are being resolved.
Yeah, so that's a good, interesting question. So I think it raises a really interesting question, which is when we talk about resources and reserves, we have competent people, and there's a lot about competence in the code. When it comes to tailings disclosures, there's the competence notion about geotech and that information. When you start looking at sustainability reports, then some of the sustainability reports, they're getting better all the time, but in the past they might have been perhaps a little bit guilty of claims being made which weren't necessarily based on particular facts. So it was sort of more of a marketing exercise. So increasingly it's going to come down to competence and how you define competence in order to sign off those disclosures in that ERS area. And I think there's a lot more room for that. So to your question, it will come back to the competence of the people talking about that. But ultimately, from a sustainability perspective, if you apply the principles of the GRI, it's about the materiality of what you're looking at. So the materiality of the effect on your communities, on the environment, on your stakeholders should be something you can agree on in terms of a rank of importance.
Great, thank you. That's a very interesting concept. Hakan, I'll turn to you now. You mentioned that Datamine, amongst other things, has a lot of software solutions, big software solutions in this space. I'm wondering about the impact digital systems are having in providing transparency and accountability data on social performance.
Yeah, look, I think the impact of digital systems on transparency and accountability in general, in not only just social performance, but across many of the topics that are encompassed under ESG, as well as under sustainability management as an activity that a business does. So the ESG is incoming frameworks and standards and all that. And the sustainability management is the activity of what the business does. The effect of digital systems on the transparency and accountability factor is profound. The fact is that appropriate investment in digital systems are likely to make or break a miner's ability to make sustainability management efficient and cost effective in the longer term. So taking a patchy approach or taking a non-holistic view in terms of encompassing all the things that you need to under the ESG topics that are there, be it biodiversity or emissions, or be it modern slavery, etc., is really a dangerous path to take, because you then end up with a patchwork within the organisation. There's already a degree of, digitization of data and information that's happened across all industry sectors, and mining is no exception. But what remains a challenge, and this is probably a bit detailed, but what remains a challenge is the process of digitalisation within the sector. So just to recap on that, so digitalisation is taking manual or analogue data and making it digital, whereas digitisation is using that data and information to manage, I guess, business processes. Okay, so when we speak of digital systems with respect to governance specifically, which is the topic of today, I guess there's the two greatest values to miners, so that relate to putting in a digital system. And one is around, the two key factors are around data and information management. That's the first thing. So being able to gather all that information from the right sources, making sure it's validated, it's true, it's right, it's in the right structure and so forth. And then managing the life of that information as well from a traceability, genealogy perspective. That's one aspect of it. So data and information management. And the second part of it is around process management. So, and what that enables companies to gain is, first of all, control and subsequent governance of data and information through one or more data management systems. That's one thing. And second thing is it brings control and subsequent governance over what's growing as a multidisciplinary set of processes in organizations when it comes to ESG. For example, you have mixing of biodiversity with modern slavery, or you have emissions being mixed with health and safety and so forth, right, in this regard. So the ability to get control of the data and the information that's there across any of the topics under the ESG banner, and then being able to overlay that with workflow enables you to, I guess, permeate this process of digitalizing this information, automating processes, automating decision making, and actually making sustainability management a cost-effective and productive effort within the organization. Otherwise, in the longer term, it won't work. Because we've seen this in other industries, be it in engineering, design development, or in finance, all these other systems that are there, they all started off in this way, a patchwork of information, manual, automated, digital, on paper, and so forth. Then they moved into platforms like Excel spreadsheets and all that. And then they moved into software platforms, which enables this data information management and workflow management in that regard. And that's something, for example, Austmine provides across all of those topics. So multidisciplinary across all the topics under E, S, and G, and being able to mix and match those, all that information, and being able to also overlay it with workflows inside the business. Yeah.
Great, thanks. You mentioned mix and matching different areas. So I guess strategic and operational areas. Are there any that you're seeing increasing adoption of systems in any particular areas, or is it across the board?
Oh, look, it's pretty much across the board, both in terms of, let's say, the topics under ESG specifically. So it could be any of those. We're seeing adoption of biodiversity by some, we're seeing modern slavery by another, we're seeing supplier management as another one in context of ESG. Health and safety has always been there, but the aggregation of that information to be put under an ESG manner is still a work in progress with a lot of companies, and miners are no exception. And we also see it, if you separate also strategy from operations as well, if we just look at it in that context, what we're seeing is that the adoption is also happening in those regards as well. So both a strategy perspective at board and senior management level, we're seeing the implementation or the overlay of systems to govern that information there. Now, with that said, we're very likely to see an accelerated adoption, I guess, of these kinds of systems for strategic and operational purposes of these digital platforms compared to what we've seen so far. And it's already happening. And this is because these systems introduce productivity and cost benefits to the business when they're managing their ESG information and data, and how they're going about that in terms of implementing those things through sustainability management in their organisations. So again, I don't want to, I guess, repeat myself, but the key things here are the value that implementing at a both strategic level and operational level using digital platforms is really around this whole aspect of both digitisation and digitalisation of data information processes. And what that enables, I guess, miners to do at the end of the day to make it cost effective and productive in their organisation is something that's put in place permanently. Is it brings automation, it brings validation, it enables you the power to mitigate issues, and it also gives you insight to navigate into the future as well with those tools and insights and information at hand. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Harkin. We're going quite well for time, so just a reminder to the audience, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, so please put in your questions because we will have time to answer them. Maybe one final question, if I could ask you all. A few of you mentioned supply chain. We've generally been talking about the G in terms of miners. I'm really interested to see how you see the growing expectations, I guess, in the ESG space affecting suppliers, and particularly maybe anywhere in the supply chain and at any level or size of company. Justin, could I start with you?
Yeah, sure. It's actually been interesting because on my previous journey, I was on the operator side, running a company called Fitzroy Australia Resources, and working in Talisman now. It's on the supplier side effectively, and starting to see the potential, I guess, impacts of the ESG requirements that are being put down on resource operators that are now being passed on to suppliers. So it used to be, if you wanted to be a supplier of one of these companies, you know, there was a questionnaire that you'd fill out, and effectively you'd be able to be brought onto the books and manage your services within that company. Now that's changed significantly. You know, the questionnaires around how suppliers are engaged are, you know, what sort of systems you have in place to effectively manage health, safety, and risk. You know, do you manage modern slavery effectively? How do you capture your emissions? You know, who are your suppliers? So I think what's happening from a supplier's perspective is that a lot of pressure has been put onto particularly the tier one assets from their shareholders and their stakeholders and the regulator. And as a result of that, they're demonstrating that they have robust control strategies in place to manage their material ESG risks. Part of that becomes the supply chain, which in essence means pressure is now being put on suppliers so that they can comply with minimum ESG criteria in hire of that company. So we certainly see that downstream impact of ESG requirements being passed on to suppliers. There's a lot of tier one companies now also wanting to track things like, you know, scope 3 emissions, and that comes from supply chain. So I only see that intensifying, and I believe that the ESG journey that the resource operators have been on, or any sector's been on, is now going to be passed on to the suppliers to sort of transition through that journey as well.
Yeah, that's certainly what we're starting to hear. Nick, what about you? Where do you see the impact's going to be on suppliers?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Justin's saying there. I think, you know, obviously we're all suppliers to the industry. You know, as a software provider, our risk is somewhat minimized or mitigated by the fact that, you know, we use human capital, which is important, and important to give those people safe environments to work in. But I think if you're in the hardware business where you are selling machinery or equipment, etc., where you've got a supply chain with, you know, resources, mineral resources required, or things going into that, people, where you're manufacturing, that becomes a very complex issue to manage, you know, which is the same, that's being handed off by the miners, which are under a lot of stress, and it doesn't matter if they're big or small. For instance, some of our investors, our institutional investors, like Tribeca and First Sentier, are investing in K2 Fly outside their mining investment funds because they see firsthand the pressure that these organisations are increasingly under in and around these disclosures. So when they saw, what we do, that sort of made perfect sense to them, because they can see the mining company, and of course the mining company is copying it from insurers, from ratings agencies, from financiers, but then they're also going to be increasingly passing that on to their suppliers as well.
Yeah, thank you. And what about you, Hakan? What do you think?
Yeah, look, we're seeing significant impacts on suppliers, particularly as the larger miners gradually mature in their adoption of ESG requirements, and how they're responding to those requirements through their, sustainability management strategies, goals, and actions. And this is also amplified as the range of ESG requirements spreads wider and wider from, we've got emissions, we've got water management, we've got modern slavery, OH&S biodiversity, and so forth. It's a great deal of topics and that's being slowly pushed down onto suppliers. What that's effectively doing is putting additional pressure, cost on suppliers to constantly align and comply with these sustainability management practices of the larger miners, particularly. And again, with that being said, for example, we have a supplier management module which enables you to manage, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of suppliers in terms of their ESG or sustainability management compliances, be it emissions, be it modern slavery, and so forth. And it's actually a really, a robust and relatively low-cost way for suppliers, no matter what tier they're at, to sort of be responsive enough to be aligned with their tier one, so with their top line miners that they're working with, be it BHP or Rio or anyone else. So Talison Lithium are an example of that for us. They utilize that tool to make sure that all their suppliers are compliant with their policies and what they've adopted as their sustainability management goals in their organisation, so that when they report that in the annual report and so forth, they actually mean it when they say, we're responsible for ourselves, but we're also responsible for the suppliers that work with us as well, in any regard. So, yeah, so that's just tying in the digital aspect again into the topic. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Might just any two will go into the Q&A now, and I'll ask the first question. I'm just based on what you've been saying about emissions, I'm interested to know whether you're seeing yet requests for carbon footprints from miners to suppliers, or what exactly you might be seeing in that space. Anybody?
Well, there is a regulatory ENGAS requirement, which is about emissions. So that's a federal requirement that organisations report on that, and that has to be done once a year. So there is that will be the case for sure, and then obviously that will then progress into suppliers and downstream and upstream. Is that dependent on the size of the organisation? No. I'm not an expert in this field, but I can't answer that question. So I think there is probably a threshold. Yes, there would be a threshold. But I think, most of the operating miners, so if you're in exploration, you probably wouldn't qualify or need to do that. But, if you're an operator, more than likely. Yeah, sorry, I meant anyway, it doesn't matter. I meant the actual suppliers to that mine.
And Marianne, we've been getting quite a few requests. Yes, you're right. There's a threshold in order to have to require a report under ENGAS, but we are, regardless, still getting a number of requests around smaller to medium-sized businesses wanting to understand their carbon footprint, and then essentially coming up with a strategic roadmap around how they might reduce that impact and then remeasure that over a period of time again. So a lot of companies are now starting to move towards proactive management of emissions and carbon footprint to try and get on the front foot for what they know is ultimately coming down the road.
Okay.
And just in terms of resource governance and the importance of this conversation, so when you talk about that ENGAS reporting, that is totally transparent, because it's and there's a scorecard that's released by the federal government on that, so people are named in that report in terms of have they gone up or down and all that sort of stuff. So you can anyone can access that information. So that's it's all about disclosure and the quality of disclosure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Right. Okay, I've got some audience questions here. Thanks for that. So I have a question from Jane Langley that's been upvoted. Agree with Harkin that governance of E&S commitments is still not commonplace in many circumstances. How will we achieve climate change, safety, water, etc. commitments without this?
Yeah, so it is going to be difficult without that. The whole sort of greenwashing element of it will have some element in there all the time, unless there's governance over the information that's both collected and also the information that's disclosed. Yeah, it really needs those processes in place. For example, if you digitalize these work processes inside of an organization, they too, as controls in the organization, are auditable. Okay, so that you know that there is governance not just over the information and data and so forth, but you know that there is governance over the processes as well. So they can be independently audited as well, and that ensures that this doesn't occur if that kind of thing is in place. Now, if it's not in place, it's going to be a struggle. You find that in other industry sectors, like in automotive and so forth, which is where I've actually come from, into mining sector, into the mining technology sector, is that though that industry specifically has had very strong governance over its environmental concerns over the years. They were one of the first to be highlighted as a bad for the world industry about 25, 30, 40 years ago. And as a consequence of that, even before the word ESG was being mentioned, they've gone through this whole process. And experiencing that myself, in seeing that journey of them, we're seeing that in the miners today. But they ultimately went through that process of, collecting the right information, being able to get the right insights and foresights from that, digitalizing that information, first of all, as a step, then digitalization, the management of those work processes to be able to, get use out of that data and information in the organization, and also having the controls in the organization as well, which are auditable as well. And that's what brings the governance to this and removes this greenwashing element out of it. But in summary, without governance, it's going to be a very difficult journey to reach these goals in any organization, let alone the planet. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Anyone want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd like to. So absolutely, Harkin's spot on. I think it's transparency, but I'll probably underline accountability. And not just the accountability of the organisation, and we've seen some big impacts of failures there, but personal accountability. So let me give you a really good example of that. So one of the biggest things to happen in ESG standards in the mining industry in the last few years is the failure at Brumadinho and Samarco before that, but obviously plenty before that, and the global tailing standard that's since been released, backed by the ICMM, etc. But a key part of that standard, if you like, is the governance element, but not just that, it's the personal accountability. So in that standard, you have a named accountable executive who carries the responsibility and accountability for their performance on or failure on that. So that, I think, if you want to change things, there's a couple of ways to do that. You either impact people financially in their hip pocket. That doesn't always work, particularly with big mining companies, but personal accountability is really, really important way to change behaviours. So if you go back historically, in a resource reserve report, it has to have some people, everybody's named in that report and they sign off on that report, and their competence is a factor in that. So I think that's a really important way of changing behaviours.
Okay, great. We've actually got a question on that tailings management, so I might go to that question. Do we know how vigorously mining companies are attempting to become compliant to the forthcoming ICMM regs for tailings management governance, as opposed to simply deriving sensor data and trying to make sense of it?
Oh, I love that question. I could have written that one myself. So when we came out of Brumadinho, etc., a lot of companies launched into all sorts of monitoring devices, LiDAR, satellite, you name it, which is really, really important, to do a better job there. But again, you can have all that in the world, and this is a very poor joke, but, I used to say to people, well, that's great. You can watch your dam fail in real time and in colour. So unless you are, providing governance over the top of that, that's critical. And certainly in terms of the new standard, monitoring is important, and disclosing what you're doing and around that is important. But ultimately, it's about what are you doing with that information? How's that information being transferred up the organisation and then ultimately disclosed?
Great, thank you. Anyone want to add to that? Okay. Got a question here from Rolf Warland. Will ESG requirements mean mining companies switch focus to opportunities in Tier 1 jurisdictions? Anyone like to have a go at that one? Thanks,
I think
Justin.
there'll always be an opportunity. So we do a lot of work. So in my postgrad, I was doing that with resource capital funds, one of the biggest private equity mining funds around. And obviously those funds, in order for them to grow their returns for their investors, they don't typically come out of the biggest mining companies in the world because they're steady, right? So the growth opportunities are in the junior mining sector, and the junior mining sector obviously focuses on areas which are a little less governed, let's say, because that's where the opportunities sit. So I think you've got that tension. So I think there'll always be a market for both, and there'll be the profit motive in terms of going to less developed companies or regulatory authorities in order to find that asset that turns into a Tier 1 asset.
Okay, thanks, Justin.
Yeah, it's a good question and good points there, Nick. I think playing outside Tier 1 jurisdictions also brings with it geopolitical risk that needs to be weighed up in the balance of profitability. If you are a company that is investing in a non-Tier 1 jurisdiction, you would hope that the standards and values and ESG criteria that you apply around the globe and your other assets are similarly applied in that particular jurisdiction. It also depends on what commodity you're playing in. If you talk about coal again, I don't think you're going to see many greenfield coal operations, particularly if they're thermal, getting approved in any jurisdiction. So it's quite a complex question. It's a great question, Wolfer, that, I think it depends what your risk profile is. It depends what commodity you play in, but certainly, the standard of ESG is being set and it should be consistently applied no matter what jurisdiction you're in.
Yeah, and at the most basic level, I mean, people that are investing in those junior mining companies are expecting those junior mining companies to invest in drilling, which is obviously very expensive. So there's a trade-off there. In terms of investing in, and you should be able to do both. And I think increasingly you have to do both. No, you can't not do it anymore.
Great. Okay, thank you. And I have one more question from Jane Langley. Did the governance landscape change dramatically post-Juncan? Was that a tipping point? I think one of you already mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, so we worked with Rio post that event. I stress the post that event. I think it was very similar to the tailings events, right? So, we all know, well, most of us know that Rio Tinto didn't break any laws in what they did there. However, they crossed a threshold in community expectations around behaviour. And how they interact with their stakeholders and communities. So I think it wasn't one event. There has been damage to priceless cultural heritage going on for decades, just as dams have been failing for decades, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's all you get these momentous events which have been happening in the past, but at some point the community and society says no, enough of that. We're not going to allow that anymore. So I think it's a building wave. And that's why it's so important. We all know, I think it's an interesting, everybody on this call is probably here because we all know that mining is absolutely critical in order for us to transition to a net carbon zero world. I mean, that's just a fundamental thing. But, we see our role, and I'm sure everyone on this call's role, is to how do we make the industry better, for all concerned. And, those sorts of events show us very clearly where we can do better.
I think for me, not just that event, but all similar events really talk to the importance of having the right control strategies in place around ESG that go all the way down to the working face of your business. for those of, I'm sure most of us on this call have worked at operational mine sites. And at the end of the day, those are the decision makers that are managing the risk. And poor decision making because of incorrect understanding, or the threat wasn't identified, or you have the wrong control systems in place. All of those can lead to significant, environmental impacts, social impacts, even governance impacts that can impact on the greater organization. So it's extremely important that everyone in the business understands what ESG is. Everyone understands what their material threats are and what the control strategies are in place to effectively manage those.
Yeah, exactly. Look, and I agree with Nick and Justin. I think governance has been going on long before that incident, and it's because these companies realise the more they become transparent and accountable for what they put out there, that they forcibly have to have governance over how they do that and how they declare that information as well. That's one element of it. The other element of it as well, that these kinds of events really sort of push the whole story along, because it's so public and because it's such a damage to the brand of these companies. That there's a big step forward in ensuring that many other miners would make sure that they change their controls and their processes that to ensure that this doesn't happen again. But once again, just harping back to the digital story, because when you've got literally thousands and thousands and thousands of controls in your organization, right from board level right through to the guy at the coalface, it's very difficult to manage these things. And it's important to have these rigors in place, and the only way that's possible across all the ESG requirements that are out there, it's only possible to have some form of digital system in place to make sure that the controls are there and they're auditable as a business process, and that they're then applied in the organisation as well, so that, for example, there are workflows, there are approvals, there's traceability on those approvals, to make sure that what happened at Junkerton doesn't happen again. That sort of thing can occur. And as I say, in other industry sectors, this has already happened. And that's why you don't hear of other sectors having these sorts of, public and large problems in terms of environmental damage specifically, because they do have those in place. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, that's been a really interesting discussion. We haven't, that's all we've got time for in terms of the questions today. I'd just like to give a huge thank you to our panel, Hakan, Nick and Justin. It really has been worthwhile. Just like to draw your attention to our Tech Talk next week, which will be the final webinar in our ESG series. We'll have 4 world-leading METS companies exploring how sophisticated software and technologies are creating stronger governance mechanisms. So that should be very interesting. You can register for that on Austmine's event page. Thank you to everyone who's attended. I'm sure you'll agree it's been a really interesting discussion. We look forward to welcoming you to the next Austmine webinar. Thanks again to our panel. Stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.